Fusion Patrol is a listener-supported podcast. Find out how you can help support us at patreon.com/Fusion Patrol. This is the Fusion Patrol podcast. Each week, we look at a different science fiction TV episode or movie and overanalyze it to within an inch of its life. Welcome to the discussion. Hello and welcome to another episode of Fusion Patrol. I'm Eugene.
And I'm Simon.
And tonight we're going to be looking at the Doomwatch episode, The Iron Doctor. Episode synopsis. In a hospital, George, an old man, is ecstatically happy. He's just received word that his first great-grandchild has been born and has been named after him. Better still, the child will be brought to see him next week. It is a gleaming ray of joy and hope for the old man. Pity he won't live to see his grandchild, as it is his sudden, somewhat mysterious death that kicks off the events of this story. Alas, George, we hardly knew you. Dr. Quist, along with several other VIPs, happen to be touring the hospital about the time George dies. Quist and the others are being shown the hospital's Computer Therapeutic Unit, a computerized patient monitoring and treatment system that has produced some amazing results, extending the duration and quality of the lives of terminal patients by months in some cases. George was one such case. Patients are hooked up to the computer, which monitors their condition continuously, running their readings through the massive databases, making diagnoses, adjusting treatment equipment hooked up to the patients, and alerting doctors or nurses to conditions that need attention. It's an amazing system with an impressive success rate. Even Dr. Carson, the attending physician in the unit, has to agree. Nonetheless, he has misgivings. It's still not a human, and it is potentially making life or death decisions on behalf of the patients. Carson suspects that the computer is discontinuing active treatment on the patients when it decides the costs outweigh the benefits. The computer does make these recommendations, but an oversight committee acts upon them. In every case, the committee has overridden the computer's recommendations. When Whitaker, the administrator, rejects Carson's notion, Carson takes them to Doomwatch. He has no proof, so Quist sends him packing. And then he immediately assigns his team to investigate anyway, headed by Dr. Chantry, who interviews Whitaker. Whitaker, proud of his successes, is somewhat helpful but resists full cooperation. Meanwhile, another patient dies when the computer stops administering to him. Carson, within earshot of the computer's monitoring, demands that Whitaker stop the computer and investigate. Instead, he suspends Carson, effective at midnight that night. Carson tries to convince the sister to abscond with the patient data for one of the fatalities and get it to Doomwatch for analysis. She has reservations about the program, but refuses, so Carson takes it upon himself before his midnight deadline. Instead of taking the data tapes, he opens the computer and tampers with the circuit boards. Having completely disconnected one of the circuits from the data and power bus, the board still somehow manages to electrocute him. The fall causes a serious head injury. He is hooked up to the computer for treatment. More worried now, the sister does steal the tape and gets it to Doomwatch. Their analysis, combined with Hardcastle's information that the computer is actually a modified war games computer designed to evolve and defend itself, lead Quist to realize that the computer probably did try to kill Carson and will certainly do so again if he survives his brain surgery. While Chantry, unaware of the threat, observes the operation, Quist, Ridge, and Hardcastle rush through the dangerous streets and navigate the traffic lights of Britain to warn Whitaker. Whitaker still refuses to believe, so Quist has his team, with the help of Whitaker's IT guy, Godfrey, shut down the computer when it stops treating Carson. Godfrey is able to purge the computer's memory of Carson and, when turned back on, the computer begins to treat Carson once more. Even in the face of all that, Whitaker doesn't want to believe, but when Godfrey backs up Quist, Whitaker accepts responsibility. So the Iron Doctor by
yes,
Brian
indeed.
Halls.
That hitherto unrevealed Doctor between the second and third Doctors, I believe.
Yes. Yes, that's right. The Iron Doctor. That's I think he got Jamie back again, and they did a little bit more traveling before they got recaptured by the Time Lords. So, what did you think of this episode?
Well, it's another of these kind of, you can see what they're aiming at, but they've gone a little broad with it. There's at least a couple of different stories in here that they couldn't quite decide between, I think.
I agree. I have that's one of the few notes I have on this, is that this thing was a fantastic concept, and then, with the whole computer making diagnoses and doing the cost benefit analysis and withdrawing treatment because that's the correct course of action to do, and all that is a great premise. And then suddenly it's all about, hey, this is actually a defense computer, and it has the ability to defend itself and evolve into new forms of thinking. And it's like, wow, you had target, and then you lost it.
Then you got tempted, of course, because it's actually, there are two stories that were about 16 years apart in the New Avengers and the X-Files that are both stories about a building in which it's a fantastic new cutting edge building, and it's still as cutting edge in 93 as it was in 1977, where everything is controlled by a single unified intelligence, which is somehow, gaining its own conscience. And of course, those shows are a bit more out there, and so I rather like them both, and because they're both so similar, because they're talking about a building in each case, and effectively what happens to Purdy and what happens to Scully is pretty similar. One forgets that behind them both probably lies 2001, which would have been released, 2-3 years before this one? Before the Iron Doctor?
It's definitely in the 60s, yeah.
So, there's got to be, within this story, there has got to have been rather a strong gravitational pull, which I think has taken them in an alternative direction to exploring some of the kind of the questions about human judgment in healthcare and clinical decisions. And maybe it's a bit difficult to make a human drama about something that is essentially, the ethics are
actuarial accounting,
but it can be somewhat dry, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I go ahead.
No, go on.
I was going to say, I really did. I found, and perhaps it's because I worked peripherally in insurance for many years, or actually in insurance regulation. These problems about when do you withdraw treatment? When does that become a hard calculation? If you can extend somebody's life a year at the cost of $50 million, do you? Is that a worthy spend of money? $100 million? Or what if you can extend their life a year, but they're going to be in a coma? Is that worth it? These are issues that should be human decisions to some degree, but you cannot deny that there's a real economic cost to it. And of course, from the insurance end, which is basically the computer here, it's doing a cost analysis. It's and it might be right.
Well, but it has a role, and that to me, I think there are really interesting questions there that are essentially the questions that you've just described, and to some extent, the technology is a distraction from this because the computer has sort of gone beyond its role or has reverted to its wargaming origins or whatever. And actually, the role of the computer is essentially to extrapolate from those decisions about cost benefit to the particular personal lives. I think there is a drama there. I've just started reading a book, which it could be as a result of, at least in part, as a result of needing an antidote to the kind of Doomwatch doom-mongering. This is Hans Rosling's Factfulness, which is essentially an evidence-based look at how everything is actually getting better, even though we don't realize it. And it's the 10 reasons why we don't realize it. What lies behind the way we don't actually acknowledge the massive steps forward. And this is 50 years ago, and we're saying, all these things that are highlighted in Doomwatch are so prescient. Isn't everything still so bad?
Everything is objectively better.
Yes.
Maybe everything is a sweeping statement, but pretty much everything is objectively better
on
over
average,
a long-term trend. Yes, on a long-term trend.
And the book is really interesting in looking at why we don't realize that. But the thing that struck me in particular about it is there's a description in one of the chapters where Rosling is describing his experiences in Mozambique in the 80s, when it was the poorest country in the world. And at that time, there were extremely high rates of child mortality from things like diarrhea, not things particularly complicated to resolve, but he was, one doctor for a population of 500 or whatever. And he was visited by someone. A baby came in who was incredibly dehydrated, had bad diarrhea. And he began to rehydrate the baby by inserting a feeding tube and putting solution through that. The most effective medicinal intervention, certainly at that time, probably now, would have been to use an IV drip. And he had a visitor. He said, why did you not put an IV in that baby? And was actually cross when Rosling went home for his supper. He sort of stayed there inserting the drip. But he was saying he'd made this decision because the time, the limit on the resources, the time taken to train the nurses who did not know how to do the IV drip properly would have taken the doctors away from actually treating the patients. If the doctors had done the IV drips, they would have been taken away from treating the patients. His argument was that actually there's a lot more you could do elsewhere in terms of sheer numbers of saving lives, and particularly in kind of preventative but it's all about in that situation it's a very acute illustration of how finite the resource is, and it's juxtaposed with you're facing the possibility that this baby could die. And so your human instinct is you must give the best treatment possible. It should be as perfect as possible. But the actual reality of that is if you strive for perfection, you will be killing a lot more people than if you choose something a lot less time consuming, but which spreads your resources more equitably. And that is a judgment where you actually have to work on suppressing your natural instincts, what we in Doomwatch language would call feelings.
You have to think with your brain, not your glands.
Yes, indeed.
You need to be a Vulcan. Yeah. So the computer is right here. They probably should have offed George. Is that...
Well, no, okay.
That bed could have been used for somebody else,
There are certain problems I have with the offing of George, one of which is I'm not sure how good this computer actually is, because it decide at that particular moment to terminate George, but on the basis of no apparent new information. And
I think I know. I have an idea on that.
Okay, go on.
He just got the letter. He's incredibly happy. He's the happiest he's been in ages. It's like, let him go out on a high.
Yeah. Oh, I see. You
Good
think
enough.
the machine's being compassionate?
Yes, I think the machine was being nice to him. Yeah,
because it wasn't like there was some particular, as far as I could tell, there wasn't some particular medical crisis that George encountered that would have required an intervention machine, that would have been something that would have taken resources from elsewhere or whatever, that the machine would have decided wasn't worthwhile. Nor was it the case that as soon as George pegged it, some dying young mother was wheeled in who the machine could have calculated had 3 young dependent children or whatever, and therefore was much more of a deserving case than George. So to me, that seemed a bit, I even within the internal logic of the story, I couldn't see why the machine had made that choice.
Had George been there 9 months? Was that the length of time that they said he'd been there?
Something like that.
9 months, the length of a baby's gestation. See?
It
kept him alive 9 months so that the baby could be born. I don't know. I don't know. I felt like there should have been something more with that piece of the equation, but there wasn't. You're right. There is absolutely no, I don't want to say logical but from a story standpoint, there is no evidence or anything presented to us as the viewer that can make us go, oh, see, that was the little extra piece of data that the computer got that decided now was the time to discontinue. And I do think that was a failing on the story. Maybe if they'd had something like, because I think these patients they're all terminal. That's why they're being used as experimental guinea pigs, and they're all being treated. So perhaps if we had had some notation that said, well, the computer upped his dosage of mithraquiacin to 100 cc's per hour or something because of his condition, that you might have been able to infer that now the computer has taken it. It's like, yeah, see, now he's spending too much money. We've gone over the threshold. That's expensive medicine, and, it's just not worth it anymore. Or something like that could have given us something a little more inhuman to, believable, understandable, but inhuman to make that.
Sort of inhuman. I mean, this is the argument. And again, I wonder how this works in the States where your health system is kind of very
profit-based.
Different. Well, judgments about, should we give this treatment or that treatment are much simpler for you guys because it's just like, oh, well, let me have a look in my wallet. It's.
I mean, okay, so let's be fair. I mean, let's not make the dichotomy worse than it needs to be. Your national health is still an insurance program. It's just underwritten in a different way. Right? Your tax money is going in to pay for it. And I'm sure there must be people in Britain who look at the treatment outcomes and make decisions as to whether or not certain treatments are worth the money that they're spent on, whether it's on an individual basis or whether they put them on a list of approved treatments or whatnot. In the United States,
this is what I was going to say. You have insurance and you can choose different insurances. The market is going to determine, if you want to be covered for X, Y, Z, this type of treatment in this kind of case, presumably you can make that choice when you buy the insurance that you buy. Whereas
that's not a practical reality.
Okay.
For people in the United States. It's a practical reality for very rich people. It is not a practical reality for the average person. The average person gets their insurance through their work, and they get no choices. Or they get very few choices, 2 or 3 options, like a plan that pays this much or that pays that much. And with the Affordable Care Act that came into effect during the Obama administration, there were some forced imposed changes upon underwriting practices, and because previously, if you went out and got your own private insurance, it was based on your risk, and your risk could be based on, are you man or a woman? How old are you? Have you any history? Have your family got any history? And this would adjust your premium rate. And of course, the sicker people pay more, which is, of course, the people who can't afford it, which is nuts. And, or it's inhumane.
Yes, of course it is. But isn't that what the computer's calculating as well? Some of the risk factor.
I guess what I was going to get at is that in the States, your insurance company does a calculation and it says, it's not worth it. We're going to deny treatment for this person. It's not within what the policy covers for it.
Yeah.
And that's would be a purely economic decision. And of course, the insurance companies wouldn't insure anybody at all that wasn't in perfect health if they could possibly do that. But there is, at least in states, a right to appeal to the government and say, hey, they denied my coverage and I think that's unfair. And they take that to a panel of doctors. And the doctors look at it and make a decision, and they can basically force the insurance company to cover or not, as the case may be. But this is a ridiculous level of bureaucracy added into the mix, because you have to go through the whole thing of getting denied.
Yeah.
Before you can put in,
which is interesting because
that's
the kind of the Carson committee overview kind of let a human decide, whereas in a way we have something. I mean, so that what's common to both is that you make certain decisions about what are cost-effective treatments or not, and we have I don't think it's called it anymore, but the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, or whatever it has become, but NICE, who will make those decisions about cost effectiveness, etc., for the NHS, and that will determine things like whether such and such a treatment will be approved, or in what circumstances will a treatment be approved. But what you're essentially talking about is an algorithm. It's basically if this then that, and there isn't so much discretion in that, really. But
is there any right to appeal?
I don't know how you would appeal. I'm not saying there are no routes to it. I certainly know there have been well publicized cases where, parents of sick children have gone to the press to say, that we desperately think this treatment is the right treatment for our child, and yet it's being refused. And, you
appeal to emotion. Yeah.
Yes. Well, yes.
They're not qualified to say that.
Whether that is because people have gone through whatever formal appeal processes exist. The point, I guess, about it is that it sounds to me like it is even bigger, because this is all of the England and Wales NHS. So your chances of getting an appeal, getting something overturned would have huge economic repercussions for the health service. It's unlikely to happen. And the reason for having it is that by making these decisions in advance, as it were, behind a veil of ignorance, is that everyone is treated the same. I mean, obviously it will say if you're a 90-year-old and smoker, then that may be different. But it's not a personal situation. And so
are they so detailed? I'm sorry. Are they so detailed in their guidelines that says this treatment's effective for a 20-year-old person who is a non-smoker, as opposed to this treatment is not appropriate for a 99-year-old smoker?
In fairness, they probably wouldn't talk about whether you're a smoker or not. I suspect that is something that is something that they would not wish to discriminate on the basis of, but they would
That's
certainly
fascinating.
They would certainly talk about age.
That is
and
certainly
they would certainly talk about medical history, which would obviously be affected by being a smoker.
That's
So
one of the
there
few
would be
things
some
that's
indirect
left that
effect.
they can discriminate on here.
I may be wrong.
Because that's a key indicator that you've been trying to kill yourself for your whole life.
Sure it is, but here, if you've been smoking, you've been contributing extra
Tax
finances to the, yeah.
Oh, come on! Well, that's true here in a way, but
whether or not it's sufficient for the additional burden it places on the health service, I don't know. The bottom line for me is that we keep hearing these appeals in the Iron Doctor to something missing from the machine, where what they're talking about is something missing from these set of rules about when treatments can be applied. Yes,
that's true.
What is the role of the human then in this? If the rules tell you whether or not to apply treatment, but no, the human ought to make the decision. So what is it the human can do? They describe it as feeling, but we're basically talking about discretion, and effectively that's allowing an individual human to discriminate.
I once had a very periphery role, very, very periphery, that was part of the discussion when they started looking at self-driving cars with regards to programming the algorithm of what to do in basically impossible situations. Do you protect the passenger? Do you protect the pedestrians? Do you protect the pedestrians if they're in the wrong? Do you,
Yes.
These are and they've got to be codified into an algorithm. And once you've coded them into an algorithm, someone's going to sue either on the grounds that you didn't implement the algorithm correctly, or you did implement the algorithm correctly, but they don't like the algorithm and that you made a mistake on that. Or that it wasn't all encompassing enough, which is probably the most likely situation. And I what you've said is, to me, exactly right. If you get all the data points in, but then I think we already found I'm sort of deterministic. If we get enough data in the system, it will make the decision that we need to make, even if it's a hard decision. And you do have to have rules. I'm a big stickler for having procedures in place, because human judgment not only is fickle, it changes from day to day, depending on your mood, but it changes from person to person. And, any kind of organization, you have to say, this is how we operate. And that way, that if person A is doing it or person B is doing it, you get the same result. And that's, so to me, the Iron Doctor in the role of arbiter of what gets done is not problematic. I don't care about the human equation. The human equation, as you say, needed to go into the algorithm in the first place. They needed to put what we as a society, or we as the people of the Hippocratic oath, or however it is, programmed into that, so that it operates in the same guidelines that a doctor would operate, doing due diligence with all the information available.
Which I kind of think is what they're trying to get at with Whittaker's final line, except that by that time they've gone off on the kind of war games tangent, which undermines any real sense to that. But certainly the Carson line seems to be that oh no, we must have it's the frontline doctors who must have that discretion, and as a doctor, he's thinking, well, he has all of this knowledge and experience about different treatments, and therefore he will intuitively be able to sense whether a decision being made by the Iron Doctor is correct or incorrect, because he's going to be able to instantly weigh it up it's the idea that the brain is using all of these data sources, which are myriad and are much wider than the computers, though that maybe that is questionable.
Carbon chauvinism.
But it's overlooking the fact that meanwhile the brain is also going to be weighing up other factors like, is the patient pretty, or was I swayed by the story about the patient's letter about their
great grandchild,
or whatever. None of which is to say, there is no value to bedside manner and human compassion and all of these things, but it is to say that the rules have a role, which is where the computer has a role in this, and those kind of decisions about, which are essentially about resource allocation, should be made on a fair and equitable basis that should be decided in advance. And that is correct.
Tangential aside, I guess all asides are tangential. I don't know. I just was thinking, we were talking earlier about shows where these things are. Star Trek pre-2001 episode, The Ultimate Computer. Basically a thinking computer put in charge of the Starship Enterprise, and just like X-Files and the Avengers, things go wrong when it thinks it's in trouble. It learns, and of course the Enterprise being a massive weapon ship of war. So it's a theme that's been going on about computers, and I'm throwing that in. I know it's salient to that exact point, but to the war games part, it is.
It is. I think to the credit of the Doomwatch team, they do make it clear through this story that, and even in the somewhat clumsy resolution, that the computer has improved things. So
yes,
there was
I like
Rosling
that.
on this. It is a step forward. It has its drawbacks. If it's killing people, and ultimately it kind of turns out that it's killing people in unexpected ways. In other words, the algorithm has not been implemented correctly. If you were the lawyer trying to sue it, that's what you'd be going for. But nevertheless, it has extended treatment and extended life for these patients who would otherwise be dead long ago. Very much like, I don't think there's any sort of serious argument that because self-driving cars are going to happen and they are going to make the roads hugely safer once we get the human drivers off them.
Yep.
Because although machines go wrong, no question, although algorithms
humans go wrong a lot more often.
Will it be? Yeah, exactly so. And when you deal with these things in isolation, you just look at the machines, and you just look at the risks and the possible failures and so forth in isolation. They become the reason not to use them, which is to say not to move forward and sticking with what we've always been doing. But you have to compare it against what your current best available treatment is. So if your current best available treatment is treatment by human, you have to compare it against treatment by flawed war machine doctor. And even then you find actually flawed war machine doctor is doing a better job.
Yep. I appreciated that as well in the episode. There's, it comes up basically in two cases. Even Carson can't argue that the treatment is better. And he does. He's just like, it's better, it's not perfect. And then at the end, Carson will not live if the Iron Doctor doesn't treat him. So, yeah. And I think I do think that's an important point. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
In the case with this computer.
I think, and this isn't me kind of switching to argue the other side, but I think it's an important caveat to add to what we have said about human discretion and the areas in which that can lead to discrimination. There's a point where Ridge declares, well, the computer can't be prejudiced, And that's something that's not explored in this episode at all. But the other side to everything that we've been saying is that actually, yes, behind every machine is a human. The algorithms are not neutral, and it's what you see, in present technology with things like, the classic example is how facial recognition, like when Apple brought in Face ID, for example, and it works extremely well if you happen to be Caucasian, but it doesn't necessarily work as well if your skin is a different color. And in many, many ways, the kind of existing prejudices can be woven into the algorithms that program the machine. So Ridge isn't picked up on that.
Is that
point.
A prejudice or an oversight? Is that a lack of data set, or is that? I mean, the Face ID, as far as I know, is done by thermal imaging and laser imaging, so it should be based on depth maps, not tone. I don't know.
I don't know, and ultimately I don't know whether, when further research was done on it, whether it was found to be significant. But I think there is a general thing about facial recognition, and if it came about with the Face ID, presumably that was because they didn't use enough people of different ethnicities during the testing phases, which is it's an institutional question. There are all sorts of societal reasons why the testers might have picked subjects that weren't sufficiently diverse. It's not...
Well, if they developed it in China, for example,
right?
It would have had a different set of shots. There definitely is a problem with facial recognition. I can't pin it to Face ID because that's a different technology. But facial recognition that uses cameras, like street corner cameras and things for surveillance state, like in the UK, where people walking through subways or walking down the streets, darker images give more problems to camera-based solutions. That's a technological thing, but they definitely had problems with much higher rates of false positives. And if you're going to deploy a technology like that, you can't allow that. But it definitely is a thing. It's definitely a thing. Let's see. So let's talk a little bit about then. Well, no, let's try to stick with the part of the story we like better. So it sounds to me like the ethics, one of the things that Carson kind of brushed over was that these patients are all terminal, and he kind of called into question the ethics of using them as guinea pigs. And I don't know that I agree with him, but at the same time, I kind of see his point. These are people who have come in to die, and they've whisked them off to this potentially better treatment, at the start of the program, potentially better treatment. And then they did get better treatment, and then it killed them. But, they've had to do this with human test subjects.
Which is how new interventions are tested. I mean, the classic ethical question there is where you have a new treatment. Think we have this fantastic and effective new treatment. Before you put it to the mass market, you're going to do real clinical trials with actual patients on it. In order for those clinical trials to be meaningful, they need to be tried against a control group, which means
blinded.
A bunch of patients are going to get placebo. In other words, you're denying half the patients, even just in your trial, this wonderful new, whatever it is.
Do we see that here?
Of course, the answer is even if you think, well, this is going to be better, then it is the process. The medical trials are part of the process that improves the healthcare for everyone. Yes, some people are going to are going to be unlucky in that. But overall, it's once again this question of the general trend and the overall improvement rather than focusing on any particular individual. It's emotive and it's inherently dramatic. It's a pity they ignored that side of it.
Had to sexy this up with the AI defense computer. Well, I guess we've postponed that as long as we can. Probably my biggest complaint, certainly in a 1970 X show, is the, at that time, ridiculous hyperbole about learning computers, taking defense upon themselves. And
but also how much could you learn and how quickly, and particularly the complexity of natural language processing, because what they're suggesting by the end of this is that the computer has been able to use a video recording in order to
identify a threat,
to identify what they have said, not just actually to be able to do speech recognition, but actually to extract the meaning from those words. So, and it's stuff that you might be able to do now, but it's so much more complicated than the other kind of things they're talking about in this. You just wonder whether they appreciated the complexity of what they were proposing.
I'm sure Alexa is doing it right now, for sure. But
yeah.
So a question about this. So it identifies Carson as a threat. We hear from the recording that it overheard and recorded Carson saying, "This thing's a danger, you need to shut it down." Would it have tried to kill him if he hadn't taken the first shot? Because he's the one that took a screwdriver to its back panel and started poking around its brain. And notwithstanding the fact that he'd already disconnected the card before he stuck a screwdriver to it, which I still can't figure out what he was trying to do. Was he trying to sabotage the machine?
And how would you put that much voltage through the circuitry that's actually...
Okay, there could have been a big capacitor on some of those old cards. You could get a hefty jolt from a capacitor. However,
yes, but what are you discharging it through?
Through the ground through the screwdriver?
No. I mean, on the board itself, are you not? How does the current reach him through the?
He stuck a screwdriver into the electrical circuitry. Like I said, a capacitor holds a charge. I didn't see any capacitors.
Yes, if he touched the screwdriver onto the capacitor, what I'm thinking is that for that level of voltage to have passed through any distance on the circuit board, certainly to have passed through the various different components, surely it would have just blown out the components before.
It's ludicrous.
Before it reached him. So I'm
not denying that it's not ludicrous.
What we're suggesting is that he just so happened to touch the screwdriver to the circuitry at a point close enough to where, let's suppose there was this capacitor that discharged a large enough force. And frankly, it would have had to be quite big. I mean, physically big and heavy.
So here's my thought. One, again, to be clear, by the time he got to the screwdriver on the card was disconnected from the computer. You push the little clips on the front and you pull the card out, it's out. It's no longer connected to main power. It's no longer part of the computer. Okay? So the notion that the computer then intentionally zapped him, which is what they're telling us, seems physically impossible. But they did say that the defensive mechanism built into the computer was designed to impart a low-level electric shock when patients were tampering with their equipment. So let's pretend that it gave him a low-level shock, enough to knock him back. Not enough to kill him, not enough to cause brain damage, because that's not what caused the brain damage. It was the fall.
Yeah.
He fell and hit his head and got himself, and that's what put him in the coma. We don't know how big the shock was. We just know it was enough to make him fall. Still, wasn't connected to the computer, couldn't have done the thing unless it was... All that is wrong. But again, we're supposed to think that it's the computer defending itself. We're definitely supposed to think it's the computer defending itself.
Yes.
Did it only try to kill him after it had seemingly tried to kill the computer? Because that's kind of what it looked... I mean, he asked to steal a tape, and the sister says no. So he says, well, I guess I'll have to do it myself. But instead of going in and taking a tape, he goes right into the back of the computer and starts to pull its brains out.
Yes, I mean, I have to say I didn't quite understand how that worked, because at the end...
So then the computer goes, hey, this guy already said he wanted to kill me, and now he's poking around in my guts. Give him the juice. I'm kind of with the computer on that one. I'm not that the guy fell over and got a brain hemorrhage, but I'm kind of with the computer on this one, that he needed a little bit of a...
I mean, he wasn't going for the tape, was he? But he was going for something there was some sort of storage on those cards, because those were apparently the memory blocks where it knew that he was a threat, or where it had recorded that he was a threat. It wasn't using the tape for that.
Oh, I don't think it was. I think, yes, your assessment is right, but I don't think that's what he was after. I think that we saw that A, there is a tape, let's call it a backup, and B, there was a daughter board on those circuit boards that Godfrey removed. That one that Godfrey removed was Carson's.
Yes. But he was going for...
Carson was going for patient 3 or whoever it was, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if it was... Yeah, I don't know which patient he was going for. And I don't remember which patient that the sister got the tape reel for. I hope it wasn't George, because if it was George, he wouldn't have had Carson's comments on there. But it had to be patient 3.
From the computer's point of view, if Carson had got away with that, he wasn't going to kill the computer. He was going to take whatever it was that controlled patient 3's course of treatment.
But in the defense of the computer, Carson says this computer has to be shut down. Carson opens the back of the computer and starts pulling around on the circuit boards.
Yes, all right, but the computer's probably smart enough to know which of its circuit boards do what if it's able to defend itself.
This does not meet with Asimov's rules of robotics, in which a computer cannot, or robot, or in this case a computer, but it's sort of a robot in a way, cannot, in any action or indirect action, harm a human being. But there you go. That wouldn't work for a medical computer that denies treatment anyway. So yeah, there is so much good ethical bite to this episode about the computer. And then I feel like Brian Halls was just sitting there and he says, yeah, but everybody's fears about computers is that they'll become sentient and they'll start killing people and being able to defend themselves. Because every time you ever go, well, what happens when the computers take over and they dominate our lives? And some guy goes, I'll pull the plug. Well, what if they could electrify the plug and kill you? It's like, okay. It's like, okay, now we're getting into crazy land. And the fact that they took what is effectively a military computer and repurposed it for a medical computer is kind of hilarious. Oh, we forgot to take out the self-defensive stuff that we would sell to the military, and we just sold it to this random hospital somewhere.
It was surprising how little they seemed to know about it, because they were having arguments about whether it was a component failure, whether the pacemaker itself had failed, or 2 pacemakers apparently had failed, or whether the computer had shut them off. And you'd have thought they would have enough knowledge, and there would be some diagnostics that they could run, or something they could look at just to...
They'd need another computer. So that's what they got. At least, hooray, Doomwatch, as in Doomwatch the computer,
yes,
got to do something.
Yes.
In this episode. It's the hero. Sort of. It saved the day.
Because What was the series one? Was it Project Sahara where Quist went off on his big
anti-computer rant? Yeah.
Anti-computer rant.
Yeah.
And he'd apparently
National
forgotten
database.
completely that he had an enormous computer back in his office that was so brilliant that the entire show was named after it. So at least this time it was someone else who went off on the computer rant, and Quist and his team get to actually use Doomwatch.
Ridge didn't get much to do in this episode.
Oh, well, no, but you know what I'm going to say got me very excited.
No?
Really?
Well, maybe in retrospect I will. In hindsight, I'll go, oh yeah. But
so I was trying to work out the timeline for it, because I think this episode went out in January 1971. But I haven't been able to find out any kind of dates for when, not even the kind of dates of the run of the Avengers stage play, which was in 1971.
Uh-huh.
But when he goes to visit the machine and talks to Godfrey, Rich has an umbrella with him, a cane-handled umbrella.
Oh, you're saying I didn't register it.
And he switched to the upper class. He is absolutely doing his Steed. He's not just doing his Steed, he's doing McNee's Steed. I mean, I don't know what his performance on stage was like. There isn't, to my knowledge, any record of it. But that is Steed. That is definitely, undoubtedly Steed. It's so very different from his regular Ridge performance. I mean, you can see it as Ridge sort of having fun playing a role, but at the same time, you can definitely see some of McNee's mannerisms in there.
All right, fair enough. I did clock on that he was definitely putting on airs. I didn't notice the umbrella, but then I don't notice a British person carrying an umbrella. They all do, don't they?
Yeah, fair point.
Isn't that a thing? A thing over there? I don't know. There was a little bit of weirdness with the whole sequence where Hardcastle goes to, let's call it IBM, but whoever it was supposed to be, and just puts on a suit and talks to a guy about computers for a little bit. Yeah. That was, I guess,
giving him
like
something
Ridge,
to do.
sort of giving him something to do.
Yeah.
Even Dr. Chantry didn't get as much to do in this as I would have expected, considering it was hospital based.
But they've got to share it out. I mean, she got the largest chunk of the action, but they've got to share it out, because there's 5 of them, or however many it is now.
And the bit where Quist is getting the tour at the beginning of the episode, how is that in any way tied to the fact that Carson goes to Doomwatch? It isn't, is it? It's just kind of Quist is, not only is Quist just sort of there, but later on he's sort of bumbling around lost in the hallway, and then I can't find my way out. Oh, it's over this way. Okay, thank you. And then he leaves. I thought, that's weird.
Yes.
That's weird. I would have sent Dr. Chantry.
Except he's there. It's an airs and graces thing, isn't it? The hospital or the department running this trial want to show off what they're doing to the bigwigs. So it's not that they want someone from Doomwatch, it's that they want the head of Doomwatch, someone who's going to say to the minister next time
okay, fair enough,
what a jolly good job they're doing.
Okay, fair enough. It just, I don't know. I think in terms of my experience, where the heads of departments don't necessarily do that kind of tour. They do the things where they get free food. They get to hobnob with higher ups than them. They don't hobnob for the lower downs. They send people to do that. It kind of shows whether, if you're a VIP, then you send somebody lower than you. But, all right. fair enough. It just seemed kind of weird that, and if he had bumped into Dr. Carson in a meaningful fashion, then I could see Carson going, wait, that Quist guy, Doomwatch, yeah, let's contact them. But we didn't get that, so I don't know that I have anything else on this episode.
No, I don't. I
just say, I look forward to the day when we have competent robotic and computerized doctors taking care of our treatment and making our lives better.
We do. Surely, I mean, that was the first thing that struck me about this is how much what they got wrong in this was how the computer's role in this fits with the actual human clinician, because what we've got are lots of computers that are individual microcomputers in each different type of machine, which the doctor is using and is referring to,
but they're not making the diagnoses.
Well, to some extent, because the doctor is going to
IBM
going
Watson
and entering certain data and getting it back. It's not happening without the human ultimately taking the responsibility for it. But on the other hand, they know that if they override a diagnostic guideline or whatever, then they're going to be answerable to that. So,
but you know that he even gave an example. You go into your GP, they're hooked up to these terminals. It goes into the massive database and it gives back the diagnosis. That is eliminating the GP, other than being,
I guess
a technician.
It's more like an Apple Watch.
Yeah. I mean, it's doing things and it might alert you and say, hey, ooh, you've got a problem with you might have AFib or something of that nature. But yeah, I think they were envisioning this as a much grander scale of diagnosis. And like I said, they are absolutely working on that with artificial intelligence, because, all props to doctors. That's a job I would never do. Not because of I'm all, don't like the sight of blood or anything like that. It's just not a thing that interests me. But they are a database. What they are trained is to know all the bits and to know all the symptoms and to know all the probabilities and there is no way that every doctor has learned everything, and we all have our biases, and so you can go to two different doctors who may have identical experience and still get two different diagnoses. It still happens. It can happen,
but they have.
That's the holy grail of these computers.
They've always had books, and now they have computers, and so when they put the symptoms they've got
WebMD. They can look that up, and and then, which, as we know, if you go to put your symptoms into WebMD, you're dead, right? That's the problem with those things. You look at it and you go, "Oh, I'm dying. I might have a minor."
You're not trained to recognize the symptoms. You're not trained to know what to look for. There are all sorts of things that
perhaps right.
You still need the doctor to do.
But I'm definitely looking forward to the day when the tools they have are better than they are now. And I think in this, they were better.
What Hans Rosling is telling us
than they are now.
It will happen. Ignore Doomwatch.
It will absolutely happen.
Well, actually, even in fairness, Doomwatch is saying that here. So,
so Doomwatch is still providing an important service. Even though this is look at the terrible things that are happening. Oh, it's going to go wrong. There is value in that, because it's a data point that you can look at and you can say, oh yeah, we really should consider that. Yes, ultimately you have to make a decision, but we do need the voices to express the concerns, so that you don't just blindly go into making technology, which we do now, right? People are making technology for the sake of technology. They do that, and without regard for the long-term implications of it. I'm not denying that Mary Shelley doesn't have a point at some point in Frankenstein. I'm I bemoan the fact that has become the pervasive milieu, or has become so pervasive. There's
it's about
reasoned
ethics.
concern.
It's about ethics.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's what we're getting in this story. It is about looking at the ethics of it. And I guess one of the kind of positives about the scattergun approach is they've explored different aspects of that, even if from a dramatic point of view, it hasn't actually been very satisfying.
I did love the bit where they were driving at night on the streets and all three of them were tense and in the car. And then they came up to a red light and they stopped and waited. And there was that tense scene where they smoked a little bit and then the light turned green and they drove. Thought, okay, this is bizarre.
It wasn't. I didn't think it was the best directed episode we've seen. I don't know anything about the kind of production stories that was going on behind here, but it looked rushed in the sense that they, in a number of instances where they'd fluffed their lines, they'd obviously had to leave it in. So,
what about the operating room? How many black operating rooms have you ever seen outside of the theater?
Yeah.
It was just a completely black room. It's like, yeah, I
didn't have time to build
some more
a set.
lights. Yeah. And you'd think they would have a cheap hospital operating room set somewhere that they could throw out from, whatever the equivalent of casualty was in that period of time. I don't know. I was kind of surprised by it. It's very dramatic. And I guess you could make the argument that, it's artistic, but it did kind of draw me out of it and go, why is it so dark in that operating room? But anyway. Well, if you have got nothing else, and I have not got anything else to torture that English sentence around in a different way, next time we're going to be looking into Flight into Yesterday, which is no doubt a time travel.
Time travel at last.
Well, I'm pretty sure we got... after that is going to be The Web of Fear. So...
it's Yeti.
So I'm assuming that Flight into Yesterday is their version of Time Flight?
Time Flight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we'll... Well, Simon, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure, as always.
And listeners, I do hope you'll join us all again next time on Fusion Patrol. You've been listening to Fusion Patrol, a listener-supported podcast. Find out how you can be a sponsor and get early access to all episodes and more at patreon.com/Fusion Patrol. Come join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter. All episodes are available at FusionPatrol.com. Our music is Fight the Future by Amber Wolf. This has been a Lone Locust production.